The Shalem Institute presents John Philip Newell, Gerald May Seminar 2013.
Again, may I say how wonderful it is to be among you. Thank you for the welcome. And how kind of you to lay on some weather this morning to make me feel so much at home. I'm not sure what I would have done with another day of sunshine. It seems that last night my voice was maybe on the soft side for some of you. So we've done a bit of adjusting, but if at any point you're not hearing and you feel you would like to hear, do send us a signal. Someone, meaning I think to pay me a compliment, the other year said, "John Philip, you should really make a recording of your talks. I could listen to your voice going to sleep at night." We need to look deep for the compliment sometimes. So, where were we together last night? We began by being reminded of this most cherished image in the Celtic world, the image or the memory of John the Beloved leaning against Jesus at the Last Supper, and of how it was said of him that he therefore heard the heartbeat of God. He becomes a symbol of the practice of listening deep within ourselves, listening deep within one another, listening within the body of the earth for the beat of the sacred presence. So I invite us back into that posture, to listen deep within ourselves, to listen deep within one another, to listen within the body of the earth for the one from whom we and all things come. Last night we heard the beginning of the prologue of John the Beloved. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. These words that in the Celtic tradition have led us to celebrate that everything is essentially an expression, an utterance. We heard how later in the Celtic world those opening words of the prologue were paraphrased. In the beginning was the sound, and the sound was with God, and the sound was God. Everything is essentially a sounding of God's presence. Everything is essentially a vibration of the presence of the One. We heard from Julian of Norwich last night, who says most simply that we are not just made by God, we are made of God. We come forth from the womb or from the heart of the One. And we were asking last night, what does it mean to be born again? Or what does it mean for these true depths of our being to come forth in radically new form? What does it mean to resound or to resound from the deepest note of our being and all being? We were reflecting on a rebirthing, a resounding that we are in the midst of or are yearning for. Last night we looked at one of the features of this rebirthing and spoke of the desire to more deeply reconnect with the sacredness of the earth, the sacredness of everything that has being in the cosmos. This morning I'd like to look at a second feature of this rebirthing, and that is the desire to reconnect more deeply with the sacred wisdom deep within other traditions. That just as the species of the earth need one another to be complete, to be whole, so we need one another as wisdom traditions to be whole. I'd like to look at another modern prophet of the human soul. Last night we were looking especially at Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, speaking of him as a prophet of the sacredness of the universe. Today I invite us to listen to another prophet from within the Christian household, Bede Griffiths. Griffiths. That great Benedictine who spent most of his life in India, committed to what he called a marriage of East and of West, with his passion of knowing that the East needs the West needs the wisdom of the East. And let's look a little bit at his journey and allow his journey to be a lens through which we consider more deeply what is the journey that we are being called into, to come back into a reverence of the wisdom of other traditions in order to move more deeply into our own wisdom. Bede Griffiths spoke of finding the other half of his soul in India. And although he went as a young Benedictine monk, he spoke of going essentially as a pilgrim to learn, to receive from the East. Think of how our Christian history might have been different if we had entered other traditions as pilgrims, to receive, to learn, as well as to offer. A number of years ago, I was giving a talk in Ottawa, in Canada. In the talk, I had been exploring some of those words from John the Beloved's prologue, especially the words, "the true light that enlightens every person coming into the world." At the end of my talk, a Mohawk elder stood. He had been invited to be present in order to note or comment on any resonances between the Celtic stream of spirituality and his own First Nations spirituality in Canada. This great, strong physical presence stood with tears streaming down his eyes, down his face. And he said, "As I have been listening to these themes tonight, I've been wondering where I would be tonight. I've been wondering where my people would be tonight. I've been wondering where we would be as a Western world tonight if the mission that had come to us centuries ago from Europe had come expecting to find light in us." We can't undo the horror of what our tradition has been responsible for, conquering, triumphing in the name of the truly humble one, our beloved Jesus. And perhaps the world has never seen such religious arrogance as the way in which our tradition has been wedded to empire and to conquering. We can't undo the past. We can, however, be part of a new birthing. And part of the yearning for new birthing that I know within my own soul and here within so many within the Christian household and beyond, is a rebirthing that includes the humble and holy desire to learn from the great treasure house of other traditions. Bede, even as a young man journeying to India, was aware of what he called the fossilization of Christianity, that it had hardened into fixed form. But as he said early on and repeatedly said throughout his life, as he critiqued what he called the rottenness in Christianity, he said, "But there are seeds in the rotten apple." There are seeds for new birthing, for new life, for new unfoldings of compassion and relationship and blessing. So I invite us to turn our attention to what are these seeds that we carry within our inheritance, and how can we again rise to bless the world rather than to curse the world with further fragmentation or with the arrogance of lifting ourselves up over the other or calling the other to become like us. In the early 1960s, Bede became the abbot or the leader or the guru of a Benedictine community in Tamil Nadu called Shantivanam, Forest of Peace. And it was there that he pursued and increasingly embodied what he called a marriage of East and West. And for him it was about stripping Christ of Western garment and allowing him to be clothed in the wisdom and in the meditative practices of the East. And during morning prayer, he and his community began to incorporate readings from Hindu scripture and from the Quran, as well as readings from the Hebrew scripture and the Christian scriptures. This was not about syncretism. This was about knowing deeply that true oneness is about differentiation. This is what we see in the oneness of the universe. It loves differentiation. It keeps producing new and new form out of its essential oneness. Bede was aware that our Western Christian tradition had become locked into a limited notion of transcendence, God as other, God as essentially above, and that we had often lived in a type of forgetfulness of what the East has always known, and that is the immanence, the withinness of the sacred. As Meister Eckhart, our 14th century Dominican mystic, put it, God is not only unnameable, and in that sense transcendent more than anything that can be said. God is not only unnameable, he said, God is omni-nameable. Carol is one of the names of the divine presence. Al is another name of the divine presence. There's a lovely Jesuit in Britain, Jerry Hughes. I don't know, some of you may have come across his writings. But at conferences, when people were introducing themselves, he would say, "I am Jerry, a unique manifestation of the divine." This is something that I've so appreciated in my journeys to the East and India especially. And in the East, I find people so ready, so eager to engage in conversation, not just about the weather or about cricket, but about religious and philosophical awarenesses and reflection. During one of my first visits to India, I was seated one day in the Lal Bagh Gardens at the heart of Bangalore, and an Indian gentleman, retired Indian banker, strolled up to me, and he began in conversation, and very early on, with his gentle wagging of his head in conversation, he said, "I have one question for you." He said, "Who are you?" And I sensed that he was not asking me what my name was, but I thought, I'm going to feel my way into this conversation. So I said, "I'm John Philip." And he said, "I was not asking you what your name was. I was asking, who are you?" So I said, "I come from the same one that you come from." And this pleased him well enough to move deeper into the conversation. And he gave me a sort of essential summary of the wisdom of the Hindu world. And he spoke of the one who is the soul within all souls, the one who is the presence at the heart of all life. And then he said, "I must be going now, but I have one final question. I have one final thing to say to you." And he said, "You are God. And until you realize that you are God, you will not be wise, you will not be happy, you will not be free. Namaste." And off he went. Since then, I have often wondered when I'm going to have such a conversation in the Edinburgh Botanical Gardens with a retired Scottish banker. Well, the East and the West have become so torn apart that we need help in even understanding that conversation. Because in the West, we've so seen reality in terms of individuality that we might be tempted to mishear that statement by the Indian banker. And one of the most important things to say about that Indian banker's word to me was that he was not addressing my ego. Emphatically not. Because what the East has always known in its celebration of the immanence of the sacred is that the only way to access it is through a dying to the ego. This is not to put down the ego. You know, Mahatma Gandhi finishes his autobiographical work, My Experiments with Truth. He finishes that autobiographical work with the words, "I must become zero." This isn't to do with self-hatred. Gandhi knew how colorful he was. We love him because he's so colorful. This wasn't about putting the self down. This was about knowing that the ego is given to serve the center, not to be the center. And he knew that the only way to access what he called the soul force of God within, the only way to access the soul force that could do the work of truly liberating India through non-violence, was not within his ego. It was down in the very ground of his being. As Meister Eckhart says, God is to be found in the human soul not by addition, but by subtraction. We don't need to add anything to the human soul to find the presence of the sacred. We do, however, need to subtract. Subtract the way in which the ego wants forever to lift itself up as the center. We need repeatedly to do this work of subtracting. The East has been very clear in its great history of spiritual awareness that everything is passing. And the word used is Maya. It's all going. It's all passing. This is not to put down the uniqueness of everything that has emerged, but it's to know it's all passing. And what is not passing is the one who is the very ground. But included in this realm of Maya, of transience, of passing, is religion. And that's not to disrespect religious insight. And the East knows about a deep reverence for religious practice and symbolism. But there's a knowing that even our great religious symbols and communities are passing. They exist to point beyond themselves. And yet in much of our Western Christian inheritance, Christianity has almost given the impression that it is a stop sign instead of a road sign. As if it is the end, and as if it doesn't exist just to point us. It's become a type of absolute in itself. Someone who's become very dear to me, like a brother of my soul over the past 8 years, is Rabbi Nachum Wardlev from New Mexico, and we co-teach every summer in the high desert of New Mexico. First time we taught together, I overheard Nachum say to some of our participants, he said, "Now when Philip teaches, it comes out Christian, but it goes in Jewish." I agree, but in reverse. When Nachum teaches Torah, he feeds my devotion to Jesus. Why should we be surprised about that? We've been so taught to see ourselves in opposition that we have failed to see the deep ground of oneness, the one who is our ground, deep within one another's traditions. And I must say of Nachum that he, like no other person in the last 8 years, has taught me what it is to be true to Jesus. And that's what he expects of me. He doesn't expect me to water down my devotion to Jesus. A couple of summers ago, when Nachum and I were at the Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, one week we were teaching separate seminars or workshops. And the group that I was with on this particular occasion, we were looking at that beautiful resurrection story from John's Gospel of how Mary Magdalene, this one who was so loved by Jesus, that story of Mary Magdalene in the garden, having found the empty tomb, weeping, thinking that the body of her beloved Jesus had been stolen. And Jesus speaks to her. She thinks at first that he's the gardener. But it's when he says her name that she recognizes him. And in that passage, the dialogue goes on because she's trying to hold him. And she says, he says, don't hold me. I'm going to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. And as we studied this passage in our group, I kept thinking of Nahum. I kept realizing I must speak to him. Because what was occurring to me was that we, in our Christian household, we've tried to hold Jesus. So I thought it was important to speak to Nahum about this observation or this realization that was coming up out of the scripture passage for me. So I looked for him at lunch, and my intention was to have this theological conversation. But as soon as I saw him, I began to weep. And what I thought was going to be a conversation was actually a confession. And I had to ask him to forgive me, to forgive us, because we've been trying to hold Jesus. He's not ours. He was born a Jew, he lived a Jew, he died a faithful Jew. He is not the founder of our religion. There's nothing absolute in our religion. He came to be a blessing for the world. How do we both love him and not try to hold him and make him ours? Thomas Berry makes a very beautiful distinction between what he calls the micro phase of a religious tradition and its macro phase. And Berry says that during the micro phase of a tradition, this is the early stage of a tradition, when in a sense it has just received its charism, it just has a sense of new truth revealing itself. And during the micro phase of a religious tradition, Berry makes the observation that its blessing is primarily for those who come within the boundaries, that in a sense there need to be some protecting lines around this new plant to allow it to grow. But when a tradition grows up, or as Bonhoeffer says, when a religion comes of age, when we grow up into the maturity of our Christhood, Berry says that when a tradition grows up, it makes its offerings freely. The way, in fact, we see Hinduism blessing the whole world at the moment through a phrase, Namaste. This phrase that is now becoming such common parlance around the whole world, Namaste, the divine in me honors the divine in you. This phrase that is used in Indian airports even at the beginning of airport announcements. Namaste, or Namaskar. Not that it has yet transformed Indian airports into places of great peace. But what are the blessings that we can just give freely? We have so much treasure in our Christian household. It is time to grow up, to give our blessings freely to the world. not to spend our time trying to defend our truth. You know, if what's happening in the Mass is truly what we say it is, a being fed on the very essence of Christ, if this is what's happening in our celebration of bread and wine, let's give it away. Who do we think we're protecting? Is Christ in all his wisdom and love, enormity of spirit? Is he needing to be protected by us? So what are the great blessings that we can give in this time of deep meeting between traditions?